see. Here we go. Okay. Now we're going to be starting. Carol Bornstein is going to be speaking on, give your title.
Welcoming wildlife into the design landscape.
Okay, now you can share your screen.
Okay.
Do something. I think you can do it.
Make a few clicks here.
Here we go.
Do this.
There.
There we go. Okay. So thank you, Andrea, and thank you to the CMPS chapter for inviting me to give this talk. I also want to thank, well, in general, the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, because for those of you who are affiliated with the garden, you will actually see a bunch of images from SBBG in this presentation. So all the wonderful work that people have collectively done there over the years. And although I don't think anybody from the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County is watching in, but the team of people that I worked with there, both the horticulture team as well as the many biologists and the educators who helped to realize the nature gardens, of which you'll see a handful of images of as well, in putting this presentation together. So, okay, so
I'm sorry, if anybody has any questions, put them in the chat. And if we have time at the end, we can have you ask some questions then too. Sorry.
Okay. Well, I think that probably everybody who is listening in on this presentation already knows the reason why this presentation was put together, why Andrea invited me to give this talk, because we have the ability, the power through the work that we do in our own private gardens or in gardens that we are involved in, whether they're public or commercial, to help make a difference in restoring or creating habitat for wildlife, because we've lost so much of our natural biodiversity, not only here in California, but around the world. And this is a quote that pretty much says just that from Douglas Tallamy's first book, Bringing Nature Home. And in Los Angeles, which is what this image is, you can see how much of that habitat has pretty much, it hasn't completely disappeared. It's amazing how much wildlife still exists within the urban fabric, and clearly in a lot of the natural areas around, in and around the greater Los Angeles basin. I know I'm speaking to a Santa Barbara and Ventura audience, but there are, on a different scale, considerable loss of habitat due to urban development, agriculture, grazing, invasive species, encroachment, you name it. So we have opportunities to make a difference. I threw in a few statistics here just because I think numbers are kind of compelling. The fact that a huge percentage of our flowering plants depend upon wildlife in order to get pollinated, and that 30% of food crops. So, you've probably heard one out of every 3 bites of food that you take, you have to thank an animal for pollinating that plant. Interesting that I could not get a specific number of bee techs, so that is in the Santa Barbara or Ventura County areas. I reached out to Betsy Collins first, and then she told me to talk to Denise Knapp, and I got this number of 92 bee techs from the Botanic Garden based on some survey work that had been done there. And compare that to, it's not an accurate comparison, of course, over 400 species of bees in Los Angeles County, which is pretty extraordinary. Most people only know about the European honeybee, and the fact that we have over 1,600 species of bees native to our state alone is pretty remarkable. And a lot of them are in deep trouble because of this habitat loss. The vast majority of native bees nest in cavities or underground, as opposed to the hives that we're familiar with for the European honeybees. And a group of insects, the biggest group of insects actually, that we don't really talk about very much. And I put this in here because of information I got from Matt, and I'm sure I'm not going to say his name wrong, Gimmel from the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History.
Oh,
I
good.
contacted him to see if he had any information about bees, and he really didn't, but he did tell me that he's been keeping track of beetle populations in Santa Barbara County, and he said he's got up to, well, actually he's been doing it for the state. He said he's got almost 8,000 recorded for the state of California, and his guess was that there were maybe 2,000 to 3,000 for Santa Barbara County. And beetles don't get a lot of attention among gardeners, and yet they actually, many of them are pollinators. And of course, many of them are decomposers. So they certainly have an important role to play in our various ecosystems. And then that last group of numbers, for those of you who are birders, you already know how important plants are and insects are. The insects that are attracted to the plants in our gardens, because songbirds are hugely dependent upon arthropods for feeding their young. And over 70% of birds in general feed or survive on arthropods as adults. A few things more tidbits about birds in general. That first bullet is, of course, a repeat about the importance of insects, attracting insects into our garden. Planting berry-producing shrubs, and you'll see some images of those as I get into the plant section of this presentation. Avoiding cutting off the flowers when they have finished blooming, and letting some of them at least develop into seed heads, because those are a very important food source for particularly seed-eating birds. Retaining the leaf litter that falls on the ground, and maybe even some of the dead branches in your plants, because those can be used for building their nests or even for nesting, creating nests. Some people like to have water in their garden, which you'll see is an essential ingredient for providing habitat for wildlife. And it's obviously important to keep those clean so that you're not encouraging any pathogens that might be passed along to birds. And a really huge thing that unfortunately doesn't get enough attention either is the time of year that we do pruning in our gardens, especially our trees. Really avoid the nesting season so that you're not disrupting the baby birds or the parents that are trying to feed them until they fledge. And I think I have a slide of this further on, but the main nesting season is anywhere from late January, early February through the middle of summer for the majority of birds in our area. So there's that first guideline about water, providing some source of water, because all wildlife depends on water at some point during its life, including us. And it can be as small as just a little bird bath, or if you have the resources to do something on a bigger scale, so much the better. Whether it's for drinking, bathing, or breeding. And as I mentioned, keeping these features clean so that you're not spreading any kind of pathogens. Providing food sources year-round. That's something that we actually demand of our gardens in terms of beauty, it seems like, because we have the opportunity to be in our gardens pretty much any day of the year, as opposed to Midwest or Eastern gardeners where things shut down for several months and are buried by snow. And so the more that we can have a food source throughout the seasons, the more wildlife that we will be able to support. Just showing images of manzanitas in flower and fruit as just one example. So that's a plant that provides a food source for many months of the year. Different kinds of creatures, of course. An emphasis on trying to use plants that are native to your local area if you really want to maximize the support for your local wildlife. There's a really beautiful, or there was, I'm not sure, planting of the California Dutchman's pipe at the pond at the Botanic Garden, and covered with hundreds, if not thousands, of flowers every early spring, late winter. But I'm not sure that the garden has ever seen, maybe Betsy can set me straight on this, or Steve. I don't think that they have probably ever seen a pipevine swallowtail butterfly or its caterpillar, as you see here, because that is outside of the range of not only the butterfly, but this plant doesn't occur in Southern California. So you probably won't get that butterfly if you plant this in your garden in the Santa Barbara area. How you put plants together in your garden is an important consideration. If you want to maximize the diversity of wildlife, then certainly having a fairly high diversity of plants can help you to achieve that goal. Also planting fairly sizable quantities of the plants in your garden so that you can attract plants that depend upon more than just one specimen in order to make it. You know, they won't show up if you don't have, in some cases, a considerable abundance of a particular species of plant. And that's what this image is illustrating here. As far as the way you organize the plants in your garden from a stylistic standpoint, there really isn't any one ideal way. You can have a formal garden, despite what some people think. Even a fairly highly manicured garden still will provide some wildlife habitat, or something that's quite a bit more naturalistic as well. So it's really comes down to how you manage the garden, not so much the style of it. This is just an image of the Santa Monica Mountains from one of the hiking trails. And here, just contrasting, very rectilinear landscape that's actually on the campus of, I think, Caltech in Pasadena on the left, and those are mostly native plants. I didn't hang around long enough to see how much wildlife was visiting the flowers on the Palo Verde, but I'm sure that there probably were some bees there. And contrast that to a very informal, almost naturalistic garden up in Montecito, designed by Isabel Green, with 100% California native plants. Well, I always encourage people to get some of their inspiration and ideas and compositions from natural landscapes, wherever they might be in your local area. Chaparral is pretty prominent down here in the Santa Monicas and San Gabriels, and of course it is in Santa Barbara as well, with the Santa Ynez Mountains. This is here in LA with big pot ceanothus in bloom. And there's that same plant in full flower at SBBG in the manzanita section, mixed with a considerable number of different kinds of manzanitas and even a few other ceanothus as well. Coastal sage scrub is probably more conspicuous up in Santa Barbara, and I'm not sure about Ventura County. There are places where you can find it in the Santa Monica Mountains, and that's where this photo was taken. You're looking at bush sunflower, behind that purple sage, and beyond that black sage. Unfortunately, the European mustard, the black mustard in the back, is all too conspicuous. Nevertheless, there's a lot of really rich habitat right there. And all three of those native plants are very easy to grow and commonplace in many of our local gardens. A more stylized version of a coastal scrub planting here with some coastal strand vegetation mixed in. That's an old image from the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. And then this is a garden that I helped to create in Santa Barbara many years ago with purple sage in the background, Ceanothus maritimus in full bloom, and then coast aster, the silver carpet, in the foreground. Grasslands are sadly not nearly as commonplace as they were several decades, centuries ago. We've lost a lot of California's many different grassland plant communities. This is a photo from Figueroa Mountain with bunch grasses and perennial as well as annual herbs and bulbs. Way back when, this is what the meadow of the Botanic Garden looked like, with a mosaic of grasses and wildflowers. And of course, scaling that down to a more urban lot is imminently doable, a little bit challenging, but provides an awful lot of habitat value. Oak savanna, you have more of that, I would say, up in the Santa Barbara area than down here. These are, if my memory is correct, these are blue oaks. with a carpet of annual wildflowers underneath. And this is a garden that kind of, I think, was aspiring to that look. This is a garden also in the Santa Barbara area, where several of the oak trees that you see in this photograph were actually part of the existing landscape, and all of those grasses were planted. There's at least, I think, half a dozen or more different species of bunch grasses, as well as rushes and sedges dominating this beautiful oak savanna landscape. Woodlands and forests are another plant community. Right here, you're looking at a riparian corridor in the autumn, with sycamore very prominent in the foreground. And an example of a garden that somewhat has that aesthetic to it, although it's not riparian. This is up in the Bay Area. And all of those oak trees up on that slope with the chaparral vegetation around the perimeter, all of that was planted by the homeowner. It was a completely weedy grass, invasive European grasses when she started. Another example of a woodland garden, this is down here in the LA area. There are oak trees here, and there's also a deodar cedar that you see in the back with a understory of entirely California native plants. Well, there aren't any deserts in Santa Barbara proper, but as you get further inland, and the same is true of Los Angeles County and Ventura, it gets hotter and drier. And if you believe in global warming and climate change, more and more of the species that occur in our California deserts are finding places to thrive in our more coastal gardens. Many of them already are doing quite well under the right conditions. This is an image from Anza Borrego State Park. And here's sort of a mashup of different desert species from Rancho Santa Ana, now California Botanic Garden, with Great Basin sagebrush and Shaw's agave and a jojoba off to the right, all thriving in Claremont. And then here on the left, Santa Barbara Botanic Garden again, with desert lavender and some opuntias on the left, and then one of the very showy native opuntias on the right with Palo Verde behind it. That's back at Rancho Santa Ana. Well, we do have lots of water, even though we're not getting any rain right now, but we do have an abundance of water in some places in our state. This is actually Matilaha Creek. Most of us don't have that in our front or backyards, but we can, as you saw in some of the earlier images, and to support wildlife, probably should try to have a little bit of water in our gardens, whether it's something as simple as a recirculating basin up at the top that you see with yerba buena and strawberry around the perimeter. That's the actual little sukubai in the Japanese garden at the Botanic Garden. And I remember seeing birds bathing in that back in the day, and I imagine they still do. And then on the left, that is a completely fabricated recirculating stream in a private garden in Altadena, surrounded by various kinds of native vegetation. Even edible gardens, if you're big on planting food for the table, incorporating some native plants, not only to attract pollinators to help increase your yield, but also to attract beneficial insects that will help keep some of the pests under control. So this garden down in, I think this is in Pasadena, they planted Verbena lilacina right there in the center for the beneficial insects that attracts. And the same applies to the quail bush off to the left. And actually you can eat the leaves of quail bush. I don't know how many of you have tried that, but I've had them prepared. I think they're baked, and they were pretty tasty. And just some of our native plants, of course, are edible, besides quail bush, which you wouldn't normally think of. There's hollyleaf cherry, used as an informal hedge behind an herb garden. This is in a garden up in Santa Barbara, and you can eat the berries if you so, or if you so choose, but of course they're great food for wildlife. Well, a lot of people don't have a lot of real estate, and they may only have a patio or a balcony, and they still can, with choosing the plants that are appropriate to whatever their microclimate is, they still can provide some source of food for wildlife, or even perhaps even nesting material. Monkey flowers are terrific in pots. The coral bells in the container on the right, when it sends up its flower stalks, those will be visited by hummingbirds. So they can occupy very small spaces and not only add beauty, but wildlife as well. So another rule of thumb, of course, is to reduce your lawn, especially if you're not using it. Maybe even consider getting rid of it. And here's a before and after image of a garden up in Goleta, where the homeowner did just that. Because lawns do not provide very much in the way of habitat for wildlife. But they're not entirely sterile, but there's not much there. There's not much there for wildlife. If you're going to keep a lawn, consider mowing it less, and letting it perhaps at least sometime during the year, during its growing season, to allow it to maybe flower and produce some flowers and some seeds that can be used as a food source or as nesting material. And of course, that cuts down on resources that you have to expend to keep mowing it as well. This is a Bootaloo lawn that is only getting mowed very, very irregularly in a garden in Los Angeles. Strive to have several different layers of vegetation in your garden, because at every layer there are different creatures that inhabit those spaces. So just two different examples here. It's actually I think it's Stevens Park. Yes, it's Stevens Park on the right. I'm not sure it still looks like that. That was a planting done many, many years ago when they decided to devote one section of the park to a native garden. And then a garden in Montecito, that same garden that I showed previously, designed by Isabel Green, showing the oak canopy and various layers of vegetation below. And then just pivoting to a natural setting to illustrate that same component of different layers of vegetation. And here as well, another garden in Los Angeles with ground covers, fairly short statured perennials, and then some shrubs getting into sort of the mid canopy, and then of course, very mature trees as well. Allowing leaf litter to stay on the ground, leave the leaves. Some people are using that phrase, not only because it provides a wonderful natural layer of mulch that can be a source of nesting material, but also a place where some animals actually will nest right in the mulch or overwinter. And this photograph on the lower left, some of you will recognize that poor will. This photo was taken at the Nature Gardens at the Natural History Museum. The very first year that we were still building the garden. We hadn't even opened to the public. And in the duff of the sycamore trees and the oaks, this bird was hanging out, thinking that it was very well camouflaged, and I almost stepped on it. That's how close I was. In the middle of Los Angeles. I guess it's not really a surprise to the birders in the audience, because four wills are attracted to insects, and because we planted 3.5 acres of both native and climate appropriate plants, we were attracting a bunch of insects. And so this bird showed up to feast on those insects. And for at least the first few years of the garden, this poor wills were sighted in the Nature Gardens, which was pretty thrilling. And this image on the right is from SBBG, just showing some of the organic mulch on the ground underneath the canopy of an oak tree. Even more rationale for leaving some of the dead that might accumulate in your trees or your larger shrubs. Those materials, again, as I mentioned before, can be nestings used for either building nests or for creating nests right in place. If it's not a safety hazard to leave some of dead limbs in trees, that's a really compelling reason to do so. And sometimes some of that dead material can actually be quite sculptural. The image on the lower left is from Santa Cruz Island. The beautiful lichen-covered rock is quite stunning all by itself, but then the bleached skeletal branches of a dead manzanita, I'm sure, is providing some habitat. Birds would be perching on those dead branches. There may be some wood-boring insects in there that birds would be going after, so it certainly is providing some habitat as well. And of course, trees that serve to be granaries for the birds that cache their acorns, as you see in this sycamore tree. Bee hotels can be effective. I wish that somebody would come out with a study of all the different kinds that are available commercially to help us decide which ones are the most effective. We have a few different kinds at the I'm still saying we. At the nature gardens, some of them were just built by our curator of entomology, just a slab of redwood with holes bored in it, and were very effective. That's what you see here. This picture on the lower right is a bee emerging after probably laying some eggs and starting to provision the nests. And again, reinforcing something I said previously about just not rushing to get the pruning shears, to leave some of the dead or dying flower stalks, because of course those seeds are a food source in their own right. They too can be used by various animals for nesting purposes. And some insects will also bore into the hollow stems of dried flowers or older wood on salvias, for example, and lay their eggs, and they need to overwinter in order to get through their life cycle. So try to leave things as long as you possibly can, or if your tendency is to, prune and have things look neat and tidy, maybe devote just a specific area of your garden to a place where you allow it to be a little bit less manicured. I'm sure it goes without saying that we want to avoid the use of toxic chemicals.
Thank you.
Because of the fact that they not only might be, even if they do kill the pest that you don't want in your garden, oftentimes there will be some kind of collateral damage where they may kill some other unintended creatures that you really want to support. And the more you allow beneficial insects to populate your garden, the more likely you will reach equilibrium and you won't have to use toxic chemicals. So that's another compelling reason. That praying mantis is perched on the dried flower stalk of Clarkia unguiculata. The only reason I saw that was in my garden in Santa Barbara many years ago, was when it moved. Otherwise, it was just exactly the same color. Just a few other creatures that help to keep pests under control in our gardens if we provide the right habitat for them. And these photos were both taken by Sally Isaacson. So a shout out to Sally. Used to work at the Botanic Garden. And then I think this might be the last guideline, is managing our pets. I used to have cats that I would allow to run around outdoors. That's my cat, my now deceased cat. And I'm no longer doing that because cats just kill billions of birds and lizards every year. Billions. I mean, it's just frightening. So it's best to keep them indoors. And even dogs can chase after wildlife and do some damage as well. Night lighting is a huge problem, especially in urban areas. That is the cause of the death of many migrating birds, or not even migrating birds, just birds who, think that their reflection, and they think that they're just flying into safe territory,
That
and
recently.
that's the end of them.
Yeah.
So
Windows
keep that
visit.
in mind when you
Close
do
curtains at
any
night.
outdoor lighting, or close your window, your blinds in the evening, so that that hazard is minimized. So all of a sudden I've got a pop-up on my screen. I don't know why. Another quote from Doug Tallamy has to do with which plants that we choose to put in our gardens will determine which wildlife survives. So with that, I'm just going to launch into a very small subset of the many California native plants that you could consider incorporating into your garden. In truth, all native plants, and even plants in general, they don't have to be native, have some sort of habitat value, whether it's just a hiding place or the food source that they might provide. The nature gardens at the museum where I worked was designed to create habitat for wildlife in an urban situation, in an urban setting. And about 2/3 of the plants were native, but 1/3 were not. And they still had to, measure up. They had to provide some source of habitat for wildlife. But I'm focusing here on natives. So I'm not going to go into all of the cultural requirements for all of these, because there isn't enough time in this evening's presentation for that. And in honesty, I don't know every creature that all of these different plants will attract and support. Some of you who are listening in are going to know more than me about these kinds of things, but I'll share what I know. So big leaf maple, if you have a spot in your garden where you provide regular water, the beautiful native tree. The flowers are visited by many different species of insects, and the seeds are eaten by insects as well as birds. California buckeye, very aromatic, fragrant flowers, are visited by native bees. Apparently European honeybees find these flowers to be toxic. And then the very large nuts are eaten by mammals. Desert willow is a beautiful summer flowering tree that extends the season of bloom in our native gardens. The flowers are visited by hummingbirds. In this case, there's a female carpenter bee that is actually, I don't quite understand, she's robbing nectar. She could easily fit inside the large throat of this flower, but she's choosing to bore through the side of the floral tube and get at the nectar that way. So maybe she's confused. Parkinsonia, this particular cultivar is actually a three-way cross of two native species, as well as one of the Mexican species of Palo Verde. And they are heavily visited by bees when they're in flower. And I'm sure that the seeds are eaten by many other kinds of wildlife as well. We don't plant very many pines in our gardens these days, probably because they can take up a lot of space, but I think they're wonderful landscape trees. It's a young Tory pine on the right and a gray pine on the left, if my memory is correct. The seeds are incredibly important source of food for many species of birds and mammals, and of course we can eat the pine nuts as well. And if you don't want the fairly dense shade of an oak tree, for example, pines, provide more of a dappled shade, and you can grow other things successfully underneath them that you might not be able to underneath an oak tree. Western sycamores can become very massive, so they're not ideal for a small garden, but in parks and large-scale properties, they are a majestic tree for a moist place, and if you have a moist spot. And the downy hairs on the young leaves are used by hummingbirds to line their nests. The seeds are eaten by birds, and I'm not sure. I would imagine that insects visit the flowers as well. And of course, they can be places for birds to build their nests, and squirrels as well. And then, of course, oaks. We are blessed with some wonderful tree-sized oaks in Los Angeles, Ventura, Santa Barbara counties, Coast Live Oak being one of them, Valley Oak being another. If you have room for one large tree and you're really trying to maximize habitat, oaks are probably your best choice, because they are an incredible food source, and they create their own habitat for so many different kinds of wildlife. I've read articles that say upwards of 500 different kinds of creatures at one point or another in their lifetime, in their life cycle, spend time in oak trees. And here you're seeing the male catkins and then the ripening acorns of Quercus agrifolia. And just a couple of the creatures that up in Santa Barbara you might see. Well, the Townsend warblers we would see down here, but western gray squirrel, I have seen very, very few of these in the Los Angeles area, certainly not in the urban core. They're just not here. We are overrun by eastern fox squirrels, sadly. Engelmann elk is another beautiful choice. It's not native to Santa Barbara, Ventura counties. It is to LA and further south, but it does quite well up north. There's a beautiful one in the meadow at the Botanic Garden. Sometimes it'll have this lovely coppery color to the new growth, but typically the leaves are a little bit bluish, and then they have much fatter acorns than Quercus agrifolia. Sugarbush. I used to think of sugarbush as being a fairly modest-sized shrub, but you can actually prune it into a small-scale tree, as has been done here. This is a photo from Fullerton Arboretum. Beautiful flowers in the late winter, early spring, and then the sticky fruits are both important food sources. We have several species of willows, again, for moist places in your garden. Really important for their wildlife value. Those are the eggs of morning cloak butterfly on the underside of the leaves of Arroyo willow. And that's a photo I took at the Nature Gardens at the Natural History Museum. And elderberry, again, this can be either a large-scale shrub or a small tree, depending on how you manage it. The flowers are visited by a wide array of pollinating insects, and then, of course, the berries are eaten by mammals as well as birds, and we can eat them too. You can even eat the flowers. So moving on to shrubs. This is another desert species, the Indian mallow, Abutilon palmeri, which flowers practically year-round down here in Los Angeles, and it even volunteered considerably in the nature gardens. They would pop up all over our pollinator meadow. Very often you would see several different species of bees visiting these flowers. Manzanitas, as I mentioned previously, are a wonderful food source for many different kinds of wildlife. The flowers are visited by bees, as well as butterflies and even hummingbirds. And then the fruits are eaten by birds and mammals. And there's just one specimen of, this is the cultivar Lewis Edmonds, which has lovely soft pink flowers, one of the taller ones. And there's a close-up of the flowers of Howard McMinn. And if you look closely, I don't know how well you can see this, but there are slits on some of these. Let's see if my pointer works. You can see these little, tiny little slits here. Those are the result of a bee, and I don't know what kind of bee, but a bee that was too big to get up into the opening in the flower. And so it's a bee that is actually not contributing to pollinating these flowers, because it is robbing the nectar from the side, the nectar and the pollen. Nevertheless, smaller bees will get in there. Sagebrushes, they're not the most floriferous in terms of flower color, but they are also important in terms of habitat value. late summer inconspicuous flowers, and then the seeds themselves are food sources. And then you can imagine that larger specimens can be hiding places or nesting sites as well. Quail bush can become quite substantial in size, and it can be actually planted as a hedge or screen, as opposed to a solitary specimen like you see here. And the ripening seeds are relished by a number of species of birds. Baccharis centennial has been a really successful shrub at the nature gardens, and here you see it in full bloom. It's a female clone. It's a hybrid of 2 different species. And our curator of entomology, Brian Brown, was ecstatic over this plant. You're looking at a hair-streak butterfly in the lower left visiting the flowers. There were, I don't know how many different insect species he actually documented, but it was a significant number visiting the flowers. We're not very showy, but nectar-rich flowers of Baccharis centennial. We have several species of barberry in California, the Oregon grape and California barberry, the flowers, the fruits, and even the foliage and the stems provide habitat. That's the nest of I think this was an Allen's hummingbird, a nest that was actually in the parking lot, the nature gardens. And Nevin barberry, in a good year, can just be completely covered with these beautiful little yellow flowers that are actually quite fragrant. And despite their size, hummingbirds visit these flowers, as do bees. And then the fruits are another food source for songbirds and other animals. Our native fairy duster from our desert areas is visited by hummingbirds and butterflies. And Ceanothus is one of the best as a genus of our native shrubs for attracting a wide array of insects. And birds will eat the seeds too. This is concha in a garden in Altadena. Wonderful for their spring, late winter, early spring flowering. Western redbud, the flowers are quite showy in the late winter, early spring. And then the pods, as they ripen, provide color accent, and the seeds will be eaten eventually by insects as well as birds. And the carved out sections on the leaves of the Western redbud are an indication that leafcutter bees are around and gathering those leaves and taking them back to their nests to provision the nests. Bush sunflower the flowers attract many different kinds of insects, and then the seeds are eaten by birds. That's a dusky wing on the left, and a cactus fly that looks kind of like a bee, and then it looks like just a plain old house fly. I'm not quite sure, but clearly flies are attracted to these flowers as well. Have to have buckwheats. Have to have manzanitas, ceanothus, and buckwheats in your garden. And there are so many wonderful native buckwheats to choose from. This is the Santa Cruz Island buckwheat. This is a garden up in Santa Barbara, sort of transitioning from its flower stage to seed. And the flowers of our buckwheats host a huge diversity of pollinating insects. And again, the ripening seeds are eaten by many kinds of wildlife. St. Catherine's lace here in full flower on the left and in its beautiful rust stage on the right. Catalina silver lace has lovely bright yellow flowers in the summertime when a lot of other native plants are starting to shut down. And my favorite stage is when it's at this chocolate brown, when the seeds are ripening. Makes a terrific contrast with that silvery white foliage. Galvezia or Gambelia, or island bush snapdragon. Of course, everybody knows that that's a magnet for hummingbirds. And the fact that it blooms periodically throughout the year is a real bonus, although the biggest display is primarily in the spring. Toyon, which happens to be the designated native shrub of Los Angeles. And Hollywood's reputedly got its name from Toyon, although that story has been rebuked. But nevertheless, it's very widespread in Southern California, in LA, as well as Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. Typically beautiful red berries at this time of year. And then there's one named yellow-berried form, which I wasn't sure if the yellow berries are as appealing to birds as the red, and I've been told by people who have the yellow one in their gardens that they get relished and eaten up just as fast as the red. Cedar waxwings in particular, as well as robins, really love the berries when they ripen. And the flowers are an important food source for pollinating insects earlier in the year. Despite the tiny size of desert lavender's flowers, they are visited by not only honeybees, as you see here, but native bees and even hummingbirds visit these flowers. Bladderpod, not nearly as widely used as I think it could be. It's a very easy to grow floriferous native shrub that blooms mostly in the spring, but periodically you'll see flowers at other times of the year. The flowers are visited by hummingbirds, and then I think, showy inflated fruits that harbor pea-sized seeds inside that must be eaten by some creatures. I'm not sure who, so if anybody knows, you can shout out at the end of this presentation. Hollyleaf cherry, you saw the image on the left previously, and then on the right showing some of the ripening fruits. They need to be almost black before they're truly ready for us to eat, but mammals will start chewing on them when they're at this stage. Coffeeberry is a terrific plant for providing habitat, not only for the dense cover that it can provide, but that rather insignificant flowers are an important source of food for pollinators, many different kinds of pollinating insects. And then of course the berries as they ripen. Same applies to our currants and gooseberries. Here you're looking at a couple of different images of both chaparral currant as well as the pink flowering currant in the center. Both the flowers visited by hummingbirds and bees and butterflies, and then the fruits are eaten by many kinds of birds and mammals. And we can eat them too. They can be very tasty. And here's some of the gooseberries. Fuchsia flower gooseberry at the bottom in flower, and the fruits on the left, and then a little bit of fall color in the upper right. Of course, sages, of which we have many in California's flora, something on the order of, I want to say roughly 20 different species and lots of different cultivars. The flowers not only are beautiful, but they support many kinds of insects and birds. Hummingbirds visit these flowers as well as bees and butterflies. There's white sage in a Santa Barbara garden. And that really tall sage right in the middle of this image is the cultivar Desperado, which is the biggest of all of our native sages. It's a hybrid of white sage and, I always get this wrong, it's white sage and purple sage. And that's at Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden in their cultivar garden, mixed with many, many other kinds of native plants. Of course, there's woolly blue curls, which is one of our more frustrating native plants to grow because it's fussy about watering. But if you have the right conditions for it, it's not only wonderfully fragrant, but beautiful, and the hummingbirds will certainly show up to nectar on those flowers. Ground covers for the ground plane, especially if you're taking out your lawn. We have a huge number of native plants that fulfill that function, from yarrows, as you see here, to manzanitas again. This is the cultivar Bert Johnson with its coppery new growth. This one is John Dorley, has soft pink flowers. And on the photo on the right, barely make out that it's developing quite a nice crop of berries. Baccharis, the low growing forms, they are selections from the San Francisco Bay Area, but of course they do really well throughout much of coastal California and even inland. I don't remember if this one was Twin Peaks or Pigeon Point, but terrific plants for cover for wildlife. Blue grama, one of our grasses that we can use in place of more water consumptive lawns. This is a photograph from the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden in the meadow. And on the right, you could see it in flower. The seeds would be a food source. The picture on the lower right is actually a selection called Blonde Ambition, which is a very robust, taller growing form of this species from one of the Western states. It's not native to California per se, the selection that is, but it does very well in our coastal gardens. And a lot of butterflies, skippers in particular, lay their eggs on bunch grasses and sedges. And so they're important larval host plants for not only skippers, but other butterflies. And here is an image of a couple of our native sedges, foothill and dune sedge. The picture on the right is from the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. I can't remember if that's still there in the home demonstration garden or not, but it's in its flowering stage, and the seeds would also be a food source. Lower left is showing it in a garden up in Carmel, actually, when it's summer dormant, but it'll green back up with the fall rains. Ceanothus, of course, comes in ground cover sizes as well. That's maritime ceanothus on the left and Ceanothus gloriosus Anchor Bay on the right. Both of these spilling over boulders in two different gardens. And if you're brave enough and have the right conditions to plant a ground cover of Dudleya, as they've done here at Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden, not only will you have a beautiful carpet of, this is Dudleya hassii with coral bells in the background, but when they flower, the flowers will be visited by many different creatures, including hummingbirds. Here's a smaller patch in flower. This is a garden in Altadena with western redbud overhead. I put the ashy-leafed buckwheat in this section because I think of it as kind of a large-scale ground cover. This is actually a photograph from SBBG on the Campbell Trail, a plant that has, I think it's still there, and if it is, it's got to be at least 30 years old. Extends the season of bloom well into the summer and fall, and I didn't put in a photograph of it from the nature gardens. We have one in a very prominent location in the nature gardens, and it is the place to look for pollinating insects when it is in bloom. It's just covered with a huge array of pollinators. And the same is true of California buckwheat, one of our most widespread native species. The low-growing forms in particular, I think, lend themselves well to our gardens because they can sprawl for considerable distance and cover a lot of real estate, and quite beautiful when they're in flower. Both species of our native strawberry can work well as ground covers, whether you have just a tiny bit of space, such as this beautiful urn on the left, or more open ground that you'd like to cover. If you're lucky enough to get some fruits yourself for the table, well, that is really lucky. Otherwise, birds will eat them, but so will the snails and slugs, which you may not really want to be supporting. Coast aster is another season extender. It blooms in the late summer and fall. The selection silver carpet that you see on the right is a particularly good ground cover, whereas the species typically is a little bit more upright and somewhat rangy in its appearance. But when it's in flower, whether it's the low growing form or the upright ones, you we'll undoubtedly see lots of different butterflies visiting these flowers. Some of our native sages also come in low growing forms. It's a fairly mounded form of black sage on the right, the cultivar Bee's Bliss on the upper left, which has beautiful periwinkle blue flowers and can get easily 10 feet across. It's one of the earliest ones to bloom in the late winter or early spring. And then on the bottom is a substantial planting of one of the low sprawling forms of purple sage, Salvia leucophylla. And then there's the herbaceous hummingbird sage, which certainly lives up to its name. Flowers are visited by hummingbirds, and the seeds are eaten by, I'm not sure what kinds of insects, but it's hard to find viable seeds on the dried flower stalks. They often, almost always have some kind of hole in them, so some insect has gotten in there and eaten all the endosperm. Nevertheless, I think they're a beautiful accent in the garden if you have a sizable patch of them. Brown is a color. And then for shady spots, our creeping snowberry is another good choice, especially under the canopy of coast live oak trees, as you see here. So moving on to perennials, of course, the many different species of milkweeds that we have in California are all an important food source for monarch butterflies. Many other butterflies will nectar on the flowers, but it's the monarchs that require milkweeds in order to lay their eggs and for the caterpillars to develop. And the one that is most commonly grown commercially, besides the Mexican milkweed, is narrow-leafed milkweed, Asclepias fascicularis. Aster, which is now alphabetically not in order here. Synthiotrichum is the new proper name for this. Is good for providing a food source for the summer garden. Here it's mixed with California goldenrod, also a really valuable plant for attracting beneficial insects in summer. Seaside daisy for the spring display. You'll get butterflies as well as bees. I think that's a little metallic sweat bee on the photograph on the upper right. And of course, more buckwheats, some of the more herbaceous or suffrutescent species, such as Conejo buckwheat here. Incredibly rare in the wild, but thankfully fairly readily available these days at a number of different nurseries. And the same is true of red-flowered buckwheat, Eriogonum grandirubescens from the Channel Islands. Both of those, if you're lucky, they will reproduce and you'll have successive generations of plants in your garden if you let the seeds ripen. Since everybody's on mute, I was going to answer this. I was going to ask this question, but there's no point because nobody can answer. But there is a bumblebee in the flower on the lower left. If you look closely, you can see it's burrowing in there to get at the pollen on one of our Pacific Coast hybrid iris, which is, a hybrid of a number of different species of native irises. The one on the upper left rather, is Iris Canyon Snow, which was introduced by the Botanic Garden. Still, I think, the gold standard of all of the hybrid irises. So they do, despite their beauty, they do support wildlife as a food source. And the seeds are also a food source. If you ever let the flowers ripen to the seed stage and tried to harvest seed yourself, you will see that some of those have been eaten by caterpillars. Monkey flowers, an old favorite in our native gardens. That's actually a naturally occurring species on the left. That's just Mimulus or Diplochus aurantiacus from the wild, growing with purple sage. And some of them, just a couple of the many different color forms that have been hybridized by a handful of different breeders. Even these hybrids are attractive to both butterflies and hummingbirds. The genus Penstemon is very satisfying if you can cultivate it in your garden. It likes pretty exacting conditions, I think, to be happy. They resent summer water for the most part and tend to like it very fast draining, gravelly soil. Depending on the species, they're visited. Most of them are visited by hummingbirds, but some are also visited by bees. Scarlet bugler on the right in particular is good at attracting hummingbirds. That's foothill penstemon on the left. And then here we have two more native species. That's royal penstemon on the left and Palmer's penstemon on the right. Checker mallow, which unfortunately still is not readily available in commercial nurseries. And I really think that's too bad because it has beautiful flowers. It grows in part shade. It's a very low water requiring plant. And yet it is good at attracting and providing a food source for native bees as well as many kinds of butterflies. So start asking your nurseries to grow more of this. Another plant in the mallow family is desert apricot, or I know there's another name for this and I'm blanking on it. Sphaerelsia ambigua is quite beautiful and comes in a number of different colors. That image on the upper right is from the Natural History Museum. And they too support lots of different kinds of bees and butterflies. This is the cultivar Lewis Hamilton that occasionally is available. It has those really stunning grenadine colored flowers. And then lilac verbena from Baja, wonderful for its fragrant flowers, the fact that it blooms for much of the year, wonderful for full sun, and the fact that it supports a lot of different butterflies, such as this western tiger swallowtail here. And then I think this is the last of the perennials, of course, California fuchsia, essential for late summer, fall flower color, and the, again, support that it provides for our hummingbirds. Just a handful of our many different species of bunch grasses. As I mentioned before, some of our butterflies use these as larval food plants, but the seeds are eaten by various insects and birds, and they are also used for nesting material and for cover. So this is purple threon, California fescue, which will tolerate some shade, actually appreciate some shade in hotter areas. The brilliant silvery blue leaves of Elemus Canyon Prince, which was in a botanic garden introduction many, many years ago. Love this plant. Deergrass is probably one of the most popular of our native bunch grasses. It can grow in a wide array of conditions, and you can use it as a solitary specimen or, as you see here, planted in mass. It's quite effective either way. Sand dropseed. This is mostly a desert grass that grows actually in fairly wet places, but will tolerate much drier conditions. And the fact that it blooms in the summer adds a lot of seasonal interest and wonderful, fine textured inflorescences. We don't have very many vines in California's flora. The few that we have, though, are actually quite lovely and can work well in our gardens. Chaparral clematis being one of them. Calistegia, which can get a little bit messy if you don't prune it periodically to remove some of the dried older stems, but quite stunning when it's in flower. And chaparral, well, that's not I think it is chaparral honeysuckle, is the common name for Lonicera hispidula. Has pretty pale pinkish white flowers, and then these glistening red berries. And then, of course, California grape, the Selection Rogers Red, is probably the hands down most popular and widely grown because of the brilliant fall color. And it does produce pretty tasty berries. This is a hybrid of our native California grape and Vitis vinifera, the culinary grape from Europe. Produces copious amounts of fruits, and they do have lots of tiny little seeds in them. Nevertheless, they're really quite good. A handful of succulents that are being grown for landscaping purposes. This is the hybrid of our Shaw's agave and foxtail agave from Mexico. This is the cultivar Blue Flame, which gets rather large. This is this photograph is from SPBG in the desert section with the massive jojoba behind it. Very handsome, semi-native, half-breed. But here is one of the parents. There's Shaw's agave. I think paired quite beautifully with Baja fairy duster, Calliandra californica. And when that agave flowers, it is a magnet for many different species of bees. We saw a Dudleya previously, a few pictures of Dudleyas previously. If you only have room for one of the rosette forming one, a single rosette forming one, like chalk Dudleya here, you can either grow it in a container or you can mix it with other dry loving plants, as this gardener has done. And here's a solitary, hasn't started dividing just yet, Dudleya hassii in the living wall at the Nature Gardens in the museum in full flower. Beargrass, we have a few species in our native flora and not terribly available in nurseries, but once in a while you'll see them at sales, such as at the Botanic Garden. And they repeat bloom, which is a real bonus as opposed to chaparral yucca. They are visited by lots of different pollinating insects as well. And there's Betsy, Betsy Collins for scale, standing next to one of the biggest flower stalks of chaparral yucca that I've ever seen. This is a photograph from a collecting trip that we did many, many years ago in the San Gabriel Mountains. Yuccas have their own unique pollinator, yucca moths. Each species has its own unique pollinator, but other insects will visit the flowers as well. And then just to close things out, just a handful of our many beautiful native annuals to add seasonal color to the garden. California poppies are visited by lots of bees. Clarkias that ring out the spring season, they also are visited by many different insects and are also a larval host plant for the sphinx moths. They will lay their eggs on these and the caterpillars will eat the foliage. Gilias, this is bird's eye gilia. Here's our annual native sunflower, and there's a handful of nesting longhorned bees. Melisodes is the genus. This is one of the species of bees that I got to learn while working at the Nature Gardens. A wildflower that you don't see too terribly often, but was extremely successful at the Nature Gardens is Media elegans, one of our many tarweeds. There are a handful of different insects visiting these flowers. They're really hard to see, and I'm not entirely sure what they all are. But for late spring, early summer flower color, this is another really desirable annual to consider mixing into your garden. And then the genus Phacelia, of which there are dozens and dozens of species, many of which are readily available, either as seed or you can buy them sometimes in 4-inch pots and set them out in your garden just before they get ready to flower. Tansy leaf Phacelia on the right, and then a close-up of a honeybee. If you look even closer still, you can see the purple pollen packed on its legs, getting ready to fly off to the next flower. And then Phacelia campanularia, desert bluebells on the upper left. And sometimes when we plant to welcome wildlife in our gardens, of course, we may be attracting creatures that we're not necessarily putting out the welcome mat for. We were constantly plagued by eastern fox squirrels at the nature gardens. They are very commonplace throughout the greater Los Angeles area now, and I know they're in Santa Barbara as well, and probably no doubt in Ventura, because they had to go through Ventura to get to Santa Barbara. They are starting to displace gray squirrels in the wild, which is really unfortunate, but I think they're here to stay. And there really wasn't too much that we could do about them short of protecting plants that they were causing problems on. We do have an edible garden at the nature gardens, and so if we ever wanted to get fruits off of any of the fruit trees or berry producing shrubs, we had to cover them to reap some of the harvest. So just a reminder that sometimes you will get things that you don't necessarily want. And then finally, we're creating this habitat for wildlife because it's a wonderful thing to do and helping to make a difference for biodiversity and for the planet. And of course, it's for us as well, because we are a part of nature and we reap the benefits, whether it's food on the table from the pollinators that we're supporting, or just the beauty, the aesthetic beauty, and all of the other services that these plants provide. So I think I'll just end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol.
Stop sharing my screen, and happy to answer or try to answer questions.
There were a number of questions. Robert had a question. He was wondering if you could go back to your coastal sage scrub slide at the beginning and name
let's try.
If you could go there.
From the beginning.
Okay, so there was a coastal sage scrub picture.
Why did it not go back to the beginning? That's interesting. Well, I guess I can just scroll all the way back.
Carol, you just need to click on the slide that you want. So when you go back to what you did before, when you go back to the outline or the beginning, just click on an earlier slide and you won't have to scroll through all of them.
But I have to stop sharing in order to do that, I think.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. All right, let's try this again. See, I thought I went to from the beginning. I thought I clicked on that, but we'll just do this because it is pretty close.
Yeah.
This one. And then we want to do slideshow. What was that current slide? Well, now that didn't work. All right, we'll just do this. Don't look. Don't look. It won't take but a minute. If it makes you dizzy. There we go. So, what's the question?
It was what plants were there? You wanted to know the plants.
Okay, so the plants in the front, the daisies are bush sunflower and Celia californica. And then the sort of silvery shrub right behind that is purple sage, Salvia leucophylla. And then the slightly darker flower stalks behind that, you can't see the foliage very well at all, is black sage, Salvia mellifera. And then the yellow is black mustard,
if you look
native.
Way in the background, it looks like there's a ceanothus that's blooming too.
Oh, way in the back? I don't remember. I mean, this is in the Santa Monica Mountains. It was a mosaic of coastal sage scrub, chaparral, and oak woodland. So those could be young oaks. They could be chamise. There was chamise back there. I'm not sure.
Okay. Now Jack has a different kind of question. He was saying
I'm going to stop sharing again, though, just to.
Okay. He was saying that with climate change, do you think you should still use live oaks as
Yes.
the oak choice?
I do. I do. I mean, there's so much genetic diversity in our, coast live oaks. I would think that, it's really going to be, I think, impossible to predict, especially for species that have a really wide range, which ones are going to be, the survivors, and which ones will adapt and which ones won't. But I think it's perfectly appropriate and acceptable and desirable to continue planting close live oaks.
Maureen had a question. Are the plants that you're showing in your slides in your book? In the book on California native plants for the garden?
I think everything I showed, I'm sure there's going to be an exception, but I think just about everything that I illustrated in those slides is in California native plants for the garden.
Okay.
Pretty sure.
Let's see. Jesse was concerned that European honeybees are out competing the native kinds for the.
There's evidence to that to support that. There have been some studies done apparently, and our entomology curator at the Natural History Museum, just his own anecdotal observations, he felt that that was definitely the case. So yes, they can. I think it's in urban situations though, not in the wild. So it's more of a problem, I believe, in urban areas.
I think she was noticing it there. Let's see. Jesse was saying that the eastern fox squirrel is a disaster to the native woodland ecosystem. I know I have them in my garden, and they were eating blue scrub jay eggs.
They're omnivorous, yeah, and they're aggressive, or they can be, yeah. And sadly, they were introduced to our part of the country in Los Angeles back in the early 1900s. So
here's one.
And they've moved fast.
But why?
Why?
Just
there's
one
a
of those
stories. They were inadvertently released from the VA hospital in Los Angeles. Apparently some veterans, there's two stories. I'm not sure which one's right. Either there were veterans who brought them or had them shipped in because they wanted to have them as pets, which doesn't seem very likely, or because they wanted to eat them. And when word got around, they were told to release them. Clearly there had to be more than one, or maybe several introductions, not sure. Really need to do my homework on that, but I know it has to do with being released from the VA, on the grounds of the VA hospital in Los Angeles in the early 1900s.
So here from Heather at the garden, any tips for small backyards, typical Goleta, Santa Barbara neighborhoods? Specifically, how can I achieve any kind of repetition or layering when I have less than 1,000 square feet?
1,000 square feet is pretty decent size. I mean, you would probably sacrifice some diversity, maybe have fewer plants, but just have 3 to 5 or 6 of each kind, so that you have a little bit of some repetition. I would probably try to do it that way. And certainly pick, if you had to focus on particular plant families, the sunflower or daisy family, the mint family, and the Apiaceae, carrot family. Those families are reputedly the best in terms of supporting pollinators. So it kind of depends on who you're trying to support. And if there's room to have, like a specimen shrub such as a ceanothus or an elderberry, something that, or a toyon, that supports a huge array of wildlife. And then you have masses of some of the other things. So it's possible.
So here's something from David. He says, have you found Argentine ants to be a wide-scale issue in gardens you've worked with as far as causing death to plants by nesting in the root ball and bringing in sucking insects?
Yes, yes, yes. They're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They were in creating and getting the nature gardens launched. The first couple of years in particular, they were one of our worst pests. All of the soil had been completely disturbed or moved around in regrading the site to prepare it for this new garden. And of course, we were watering to establish the new garden, and the garden was launched during the last massive drought. You know, the 6 or 7 year drought that we had in the early 2010s. And so they were drawn to, you know, all the supplemental irrigation that we were providing in order to get the plants established. And yes, they brought scale and mealybugs, and continue to be a problem in some parts of that garden. So yeah, they're nasty. They're hard to contend with, no question.
So Paula asks, any recommendation for south-facing steep slopes in the Conejo Valley?
South-facing steep slopes in the Conejo Valley.
It's the last one I have here.
Is Rory still on this call? My mind is kind of frying here.
Yes. That's a toughie. You know, Conejo buckwheat.
Yeah,
All the volcanic slopes we have, and you know, the Dudley.
I think black sage. Black
sage would be great.
Lemonade berry.
Perfect. Yeah, and Toyon too. Actually, it seems to go everywhere.
Right. Chemise would be fine too.
Yep.
Yeah, there's plenty of things that would work.
Mm-hmm.
That was the last question?
That's the last question. If anybody wants to, you know, raise a hand or something, if there's any other questions.
I had a question. Did anybody have an answer for my question about
Tom has a
bladder pod?
question.
Who eats the seeds?
Yeah,
Does
people do.
know?
People eat bladder pod seeds.
That's true. I've read that you can cook them. You don't eat them raw. You cook them and they taste a little bit like sort of nutty peas or something. I've never tried it, but
they suggest that you either roast them or boil them slightly.
boil. Yeah.
Okay,
Have you
Tom,
tried them,
I'm trying to unmute you, but I can't. Could you put it in the chat? Oh, maybe I did it.
I was just clapping.
Oh, you were clapping.
Is that Tom Mulroy?
It sure sounds
It
like
is.
him.
Hi, Carol.
I recognize your voice.
A lovely presentation. I loved it.
Thank you. Good to not see you. I just see your name.
Anybody else have anything they want to say?
Thanks, Carol.
Fabulous. Beautiful photograph.
Welcome.
Loved it.
Fun.
Thank you, Carol. Great program. Thank you so much.
Here, here.
Oh, my pleasure. I hope
Thank you,
everybody
Carol.
got some new tidbits to take home. Although my guess is that
Absolutely.
I'm speaking to, you know, the converted and people who already know all of this, but still it's fun to look at pretty pictures.
It is.
So go enjoy a glass of wine.
You
know,
bet.
If you want to tell any of your friends about this program, we had 2 previous programs. We're going to try to get them on YouTube. So, you know, when it happens, we'll announce it to everybody in on the CMPS email.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks to everybody for joining in.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
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 Thank you. Hi, Tom.